A 2-year-old boy in rural Nebraska drew a map with crayons, a detailed layout of a farm he'd never seen, complete with a barn, a windmill, and an X marking a specific spot in a field. When his parents followed that map, it led them 37 miles away to an abandoned property. And buried exactly where the child had marked the X, they found a rusted toolbox containing a name: William James Harlow, 1952. How could a toddler who barely spoke in complete sentences draw a precise map to a stranger's farm and know where a man had buried his most precious possession 70 years ago? The drawing didn't look like much at first, just crayon scribbles that any 2-year-old might make. But when Sarah Brennan looked closer at what her son had drawn, her blood ran cold. There was a house, a barn with a distinctive sloped roof, a windmill positioned exactly northeast of the barn, a row of trees forming a windbreak on the western edge, and in the bottom right corner, a large X marked in bright red crayon. 2-year-old Jacob had drawn this the same way he drew everything, with the focused intensity of a child lost in his own world. But unlike his usual scribbles of trucks and dogs, this drawing had proportion. It had accuracy. It had intention. When Sarah's husband Tom came home from work that evening and saw the drawing stuck to the refrigerator, he froze. "Where did he see this?" Tom whispered. "He didn't," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "He just drew it this afternoon while I was making lunch. He kept saying, 'My farm,' 'over and over." Jacob was standing in the doorway, clutching his favorite stuffed horse. He pointed at the drawing with a chubby finger. "Home," he said simply. "Want to go home." That drawing would lead the Brennan family on a journey that would challenge everything they thought they knew about memory, identity, and whether a soul can carry the past into a new life. This is the story of how a toddler's crayon map unlocked a 70-year-old mystery and reunited him with a life he shouldn't remember. Jacob Brennan was born on a freezing January morning in 2022 in a small town outside Grand Island, Nebraska. His parents, Tom and Sarah, were both teachers. Tom taught high school history, Sarah taught second grade. They lived in a modest house with a backyard big enough for a swing set and a vegetable garden. Jacob was their first child, and they approached parenthood the way teachers approach everything, with research, planning, and careful documentation. Sarah kept a baby journal, noting every milestone. First smile, first tooth, first steps. Jacob's first year was unremarkable in the best possible way. He was a happy baby who loved being outside, even in the harsh Nebraska winters. He'd stare at the horizon for long stretches, fascinated by the flat landscape and endless sky that defined their corner of the Great Plains. But shortly after his second birthday, Jacob started saying something strange. "My farm," he'd say, pointing out the car window as they drove past fields and homesteads. "That's not my farm." At first, Tom and Sarah assumed he was playing pretend. 2-year-olds had wild imaginations. Maybe he'd seen a farm in a picture book and decided it was his, but Jacob kept saying it. Every time they drove anywhere, he'd study the landscape with an intensity that seemed wrong for a toddler. He'd point at farms and shake his head. "Not mine. Not mine." "Where's your farm, buddy?" Tom would ask, humoring him. Jacob would point vaguely northeast. "That way. My farm that way." Then came the night terrors. Jacob would wake up screaming about the storm and the cows and couldn't get them all inside. He'd sob about losing something precious, something important, but he couldn't explain what. His vocabulary was still limited. Most 2-year-olds only knew about 50 words. But Jacob would cry and say, "Gone, gone, all gone," with a grief that seemed far too deep for a child who'd never lost anything. Sarah would hold him, rocking him back to sleep, wondering what could cause such distress in a little boy who'd lived such a safe, sheltered life. Then Jacob started talking about Will. "When I was Will," he'd say casually, the same way other kids said, "when I was a baby." "When I was Will, I had cows, lots of cows, and chickens, and a good dog named Rusty." "Who's Will?" Sarah asked gently. Jacob looked at her with frustration, as if the answer was obvious. "Me. I'm Will. But now I'm Jacob." Turkey. That night, Sarah pulled out her laptop and did what any modern parent would do. She searched "Toddler Claims Past Life." She expected to find articles about childhood fantasy and imagination development. Instead, she found hundreds of documented cases. Children who remembered being soldiers, shopkeepers, accident victims. Children who provided names, dates, and locations that were later verified. And many of those cases involved children recognizing places they'd never been. She also learned something important. These memories typically emerged between ages 2 and 5, and usually faded by age 7 or 8. If Jacob was truly remembering something real, they had a narrow window. The next morning, Sarah made a decision. She'd document everything Jacob said about Will and my farm. She bought a journal and started writing, and Jacob had a lot to say. Over the following weeks, Jacob's statements about the farm became more specific and more detailed than any 2-year-old should be capable of expressing. He described the barn as red with white trim, and said there was a big crack in the wall on the north side from when the wind got bad. He talked about a windmill that squeaked when it turned, and a house with green shutters and a porch that wrapped around. Sarah wrote it all down, even though half of what Jacob said came out in broken toddler grammar. The barn, it read, it had crack from wind, big wind. But some things Jacob said were eerily articulate, as if he was accessing vocabulary he shouldn't possess. One afternoon, while playing with his toy tractors, Jacob looked up and said, "The south field was best for corn. The north field held water too long in spring. Better for hay." Sarah stared at her son. Jacob had never been to a working farm. He'd never heard anyone discuss crop rotation or soil drainage. Where was this coming from? Another time, while they were driving past a farm supply store, Jacob pointed excitedly. "That's where Will bought the fence posts. The man there had a mustache and always gave me peppermint candy." "When did you go there, sweetie?" Sarah asked. Jacob's face scrunched up in concentration. "A long time ago. Before I was Jacob. When I was big." The most striking moment came one evening when Tom was watching the weather forecast. The meteorologist mentioned a severe thunderstorm warning. Jacob's face went pale. He started breathing fast, panicking. "Gotta get the cows inside. Gotta close the barn doors. The storm's coming." Tom knelt down, trying to calm him. "Jacob, buddy, we don't have cows. We're safe inside." But Jacob was inconsolable, crying with a terror that seemed to come from lived experience. Couldn't save them all. The lightning, the barn, everything gone. It took an hour to calm him down, and afterward, Jacob whispered something that made Sarah's hands shake. That's how Will died, in the storm, trying to save the animals. The crayon map appeared on a Tuesday afternoon in March. Sarah had given Jacob some paper and crayons while she prepared lunch. He usually drew trucks, animals, or abstract scribbles. But this time, when Sarah checked on him, she found something different. Jacob had drawn a detailed aerial view of a property. There was a rectangular shape he'd labeled, with her help sounding out the letters. Barn. A small house with a triangle roof. A circle with lines radiating from it, clearly a windmill. a row of vertical lines representing trees, and in the corner, a large red X. "What's this, Jacob?" Sarah asked, her heart pounding. "My farm," Jacob said matter-of-factly. "That's where home is." He pointed to the X. "That's where Will put the important box, under the ground, so nobody would take it." Sarah felt dizzy. She sat down and looked at the drawing more carefully. It wasn't just random shapes, it had spatial relationships. The barn was positioned relative to the house. The windmill was northeast of the barn. The trees formed a windbreak on what Jacob had indicated was the western edge. This wasn't a 2-year-old's imaginative play. This was a map. When Tom got home, Sarah showed him the drawing. They sat at the kitchen table, staring at it, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. "We need to find out if this place exists," Tom said finally. That night, after Jacob was asleep, Tom and Sarah began their search. They started with property records for rural areas northeast of Grand Island, the direction Jacob always pointed. They looked at satellite imagery on Google Maps, scrolling through hundreds of farms, looking for a layout that matched Jacob's drawing. It took 3 hours, but at 11:43 p.m., Sarah gasped. "Tom, look at this!" On the screen was an abandoned property approximately 37 miles northeast of their home, just outside the tiny town of Fullerton, Nebraska. The satellite image showed an old house, a collapsed barn with a distinctive sloped roof, and the concrete foundation of what had once been a windmill. A row of trees lined the western edge exactly as Jacob had drawn. The layout matched perfectly. Tom zoomed in, his hands shaking. "This is it. This is the place," he drew. "But who owns it?" Sarah whispered. "And who was Will?" They spent the next 2 hours researching property records. The land had been abandoned since 2003. Before that, it had belonged to the estate of William James Harlow, who had died in 1998. The property had never sold. It had simply sat empty for decades, slowly decaying. Tom pulled up the county obituary records. He found William James Harlow's death notice, published in the Fullerton Gazette in June 1998. William James Harlow, age 71, died June 14, 1998, following injuries sustained during a severe thunderstorm on his farm. He is survived by no immediate family. A lifelong farmer, William was known for his dedication to his land and his animals. Services will be private. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. He died in a storm, trying to save his animals. Just like Jacob said. Tom looked at his wife. "We have to go there. We have to take Jacob to that farm." The next Saturday, the Brennan family drove 37 miles northeast, following the map Jacob had drawn. Jacob sat in his car seat, clutching his stuffed horse, watching the landscape pass. He didn't look excited like a toddler on an adventure. He looked focused, searching. As they turned onto County Road 47, Jacob suddenly sat up straight. "This way. Turn here." Tom hadn't planned to turn yet. They were still a mile from the property according to GPS. But something in Jacob's voice made him turn. They drove down a gravel road lined with bare winter trees. And then, around a curve, they saw it. An old farmhouse with faded green shutters, a collapsed red barn with white trim, a massive crack visible in the north wall, the concrete base of a windmill, the structure itself long gone, a row of cottonwood trees standing like sentries on the western edge. It matched Jacob's drawing exactly. Sarah felt like she couldn't breathe. "Oh my God. Tom. He's never been here. We've never driven this way. How did he know?" Tom pulled the car to a stop in front of the property. It was clearly abandoned. Waist-high grass, broken windows, a no trespassing sign barely visible through the overgrowth. Jacob was bouncing in his car seat, pointing. Home! That's home. That's my house. Tom looked at Sarah. They'd come this far. They had to see what would happen next. They got out of the car and approached the property line. Tom had looked up the ownership records. The land belonged to the county now, held in permanent limbo by estate complications. Technically, they were trespassing, but the place was so remote and forgotten that Tom doubted anyone would care. "Jacob," Sarah said gently, lifting him out of his car seat. "Do you recognize this place?" Jacob didn't answer. He was already running toward the house, his small legs pumping through the tall grass. "My porch!" he shouted, pointing at the wraparound porch that was half collapsed. "My door! It blew!" The front door, though faded and peeling, had once been painted blue. Jacob ran to the barn next, stopping in front of the massive crack in the north wall. He reached out and touched it with both hands, his face sad. "The storm did this," he said quietly. "The wind. I couldn't fix it after. I tried, but my hands hurt too much." Sarah knelt beside her son, tears streaming down her face. "Jacob, what do you remember about living here?" Jacob looked at the collapsed barn with eyes that seemed far too old for a 2-year-old. "I had 63 cows. 17 were dairy cows. The rest were beef cattle. I had chickens, lots of chickens, and Rusty. Rusty was the best dog." He turned and pointed to a spot near the barn. "Rusty's buried there, under the oak tree." Sarah looked. There was indeed an old oak tree where Jacob was pointing, and beneath it, barely visible through the overgrowth, was a small stone marker. Tom walked over and knelt down, pulling away the grass and weeds. Carved roughly into the stone was one word: Rusty. Tom, Sarah, and Jacob stood in the overgrown farmyard, staring at Rusty's grave marker. The reality of what they were experiencing was beginning to sink in. This wasn't imagination, wasn't coincidence. Their 2-year-old son had led them to a place he'd never been and recognized things he couldn't possibly know. "We need to find people who knew William Harlow," Tom said finally. "People who can verify what Jacob's telling us." They drove into Fullerton, a town of barely 800 people where everyone knew everyone. Tom parked in front of the town's only diner, a weathered building with a faded sign reading Betty's Kitchen. Inside, the lunch crowd was small, a handful of farmers in worn jackets, an elderly couple sharing a piece of pie. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes, approached their table. "You folks just passing through?" she asked. Tom hesitated. "How do you explain this?" "Actually, we're looking for information about someone who used to live around here." "William Harlow?" The waitress's expression shifted, surprise mixed with sadness. "Billy Harlow? Haven't heard that name in years. He passed back in '98. Terrible thing, that storm." "Did you know him?" Sarah asked. "Everyone knew Billy. I grew up 3 farms over from his place. He was a good man. Kept to himself mostly after his wife died, but he was always fair and honest." She glanced at Jacob, who was coloring on a kid's menu. "Why are you asking about Billy?" Tom and Sarah exchanged glances. Sarah took a breath. "This is going to sound strange, but our son, Jacob, has been talking about a farm." He drew a map that led us to the Harlow property. "And he's been saying things, specific things, about living there." The waitress stared at them. "What kind of things?" "He knew about the dog buried under the oak tree," Tom said quietly. "He knew the barn door was cracked from a storm. He knew the front door was blue." The waitress set down her coffee pot slowly. "The blue door. Billy painted that himself in 1985. I remember because he chose the strangest shade. Bright blue, like a robin's egg. His wife had always wanted a blue door. Jacob looked up from his coloring. He studied the waitress's face, then smiled. "You're Betty. You made the best apple pie. You brought me one after Martha died." The waitress's face went pale. "How? How could he know that? I did bring Billy a pie after his wife passed. That was 1989, but I never told anyone about that. It was just a small kindness between neighbors." She pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. "What's happening here?" Over the next hour, Betty called several people, elderly residents who had known William Harlow. Two of them agreed to come to the diner: Harold Jensen, who'd been Will's closest neighbor, and Margaret Chen, who'd taught Sunday school and had known every family in the area for 60 years. Harold arrived first, a stooped man in his late 80s with weathered hands and sharp eyes. He sat down across from Jacob and studied the little boy carefully. "Betty says your boy knows about Billy Harlow," Harold said, his voice skeptical but curious. "Tell him about the cows, Jacob," Sarah prompted gently. Jacob looked at Harold. "I had 63 cows. You helped me when the fence broke in the east pasture. You brought your tractor. We fixed it together." Harold's eyebrows shot up. "That happened in 1994. How the hell does a toddler know about that?" "You had a thermos of coffee," Jacob continued. "You always had coffee, even in summer. You said coffee was the only thing that made morning chores worth doing." Harold's voice cracked. "Billy used to tease me about that. Said I'd bleed coffee instead of blood if you cut me open." He looked at Tom and Sarah. "What's going on here? This isn't natural." Margaret arrived next, a tiny woman with snow-white hair and a walker. She sat down slowly and looked at Jacob with a mixture of wonder and fear. "Hello, young man," she said softly. Jacob studied her face. Then his eyes lit up with recognition. "Miss Margaret, you brought me cookies after church. Snickerdoodles. You made the best snickerdoodles." Margaret's hand went to her mouth. "Billy's favorite. I'd bake them every Sunday and bring him a tin, because I knew he didn't bake for himself after Martha passed." "You wore a purple hat?" Jacob said. "Always purple. You said it was your signature color." Margaret started crying. "I did. For 30 years, I wore purple hats to church. Billy used to say he could spot me in a crowd from a mile away." She reached across the table with a shaking hand and touched Jacob's small fingers. "Who are you, child? How do you know these things?" Jacob's voice was matter-of-fact, the way only a 2-year-old could be. "I'm Jacob now, but I used to be Will. And I miss my farm." Harold, despite his skepticism, agreed to accompany the family back to the Harlow property. "If there's something buried where the boy says, 'I want to see it,'" he said gruffly. Margaret couldn't make the trip due to her mobility issues, but she squeezed Jacob's hand before they left. "If you're really Billy Harlow somehow, then welcome back, dear friend. We missed you." Back at the farm, Jacob led the group directly to the spot he'd marked with an X on his drawing. The southeast corner of the property, about 30 yards from the collapsed barn, near an old fence post. "Here," Jacob said, pointing at the ground. "Will buried it here. The important box, with all the things that mattered." Tom had brought a shovel from their car. He looked at Harold. "Should we?" Harold shrugged. "We've come this far. Might as well see if the boy's right." Tom began digging. The soil was hard from winter, but he worked steadily. 1 foot down, 2 feet, 3 feet, and then the shovel hit something metal. Sarah gasped. Jacob bounced on his toes excitedly. "That's it! That's the box!" Tom carefully cleared away the soil, revealing a metal toolbox, badly rusted, but still intact. He lifted it out of the hole and set it on the ground. Harold stared at it. "I'll be damned. There really is something buried here. The box was locked. The padlock rusted solid. Tom had to break it off with a rock. His hands were shaking as he opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in deteriorating plastic bags, were the remnants of a life. A faded photograph of a young couple. A man in his 30s with kind eyes and a woman with a bright smile, standing in front of the blue door. A marriage certificate. William James Harlow and Martha Louise Harlow, married June 12, 1955. A small leather journal, its pages brittle with age. A pocket watch, tarnished but still intact. A child's toy horse, nearly identical to the stuffed horse Jacob was clutching. And a handwritten letter, the ink faded but still legible. Tom picked up the letter carefully. His voice shook as he read it aloud. To whoever finds this, I'm burying this box because I'm getting old, and my hands don't work like they used to. The arthritis is bad now. I probably don't have many years left, and I never had children to leave things to, but these items are precious to me. The photograph is me and Martha on our wedding day. She was the light of my life. She died in 1989, and I've missed her every day since. The pocket watch was my father's. He gave it to me when I took over the farm in 1952. The little horse was mine when I was a boy. My mother made it for me. I carried it in my pocket every day until I was 12. This farm has been my whole life. Every sunrise, every harvest, every storm. I loved this land. I loved my animals. I did my best. If you find this, I hope you understand. A man's life is measured not by what he leaves behind, but by how he lived. I lived honestly. I worked hard. I tried to be good. That's all any of us can do. William J. Harlow, March 15, 1998. Tom's voice broke on the final words. The letter had been written just 3 months before William died in the storm. Harold was openly weeping. That's Billy's handwriting. I'd recognize it anywhere. He wrote just like that. Simple, honest, straight to the point. Jacob reached into the box and pulled out the little toy horse. He held it next to his stuffed horse, comparing them. They were remarkably similar. Same brown color, same simple design. Will's mama made this, Jacob said quietly. Her name was Elizabeth. She died when Will was 16. He kept the horse his whole life because it reminded him of her. Harold stared at the child. How could you know that? Billy never talked about his mother. She died in 1943, before I was even born. Sarah was crying. Tom was crying. Even Harold, the skeptical farmer who'd seen everything in his 88 years, was crying. Because there was no rational explanation. No way a 2-year-old could know these things. No way he could have led them to this exact spot, to a box buried by a man who'd died 26 years ago. Unless Jacob was telling the truth. Unless he really was, somehow, carrying the memories of William James Harlow. They sat in the overgrown grass near the collapsed barn, the contents of the box spread out before them like artifacts from an ancient civilization. The sun was setting, casting golden light across the abandoned farm. Jacob held the toy horse and the pocket watch, running his small fingers over them with a gentleness that seemed beyond his years. Will was happy here, Jacob said softly, even after Martha died, even when his hands hurt. He loved the land. He loved waking up to feed the animals. He loved watching the corn grow. He loved sitting on the porch at sunset. He looked up at the collapsed barn, his face sad. He tried to save them during the storm. The cows were scared. The lightning was so bright. He got most of them into the barn, but then the wind. The beam fell. It hit him on the head. He tried to get up, but he couldn't. And then everything went dark. Harold covered his face with his hands. The coroner said he died from blunt force trauma. They found him in the barn after the storm passed. He'd been trying to secure the animals. Jacob nodded. He wasn't scared at the end. He was just sad he couldn't finish. Sad he couldn't take care of them all. Sarah pulled her son close. But you remember him, sweetie. You're keeping his memories alive. Jacob looked at her with those impossibly old eyes. I think that's why I came back. Will didn't have any family. Nobody to remember him. Nobody to know his life mattered. So his memories came to me. So someone would know. They sat in silence for a long moment, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. Then Jacob stood up. He walked to the porch of the old house, climbed the sagging steps carefully, and placed his hand on the blue door. Thank you for taking care of the farm, he whispered. Thank you for loving Martha. Thank you for being good to the animals. Your life mattered, Will. I promise I'll remember. And then, to everyone's shock, Jacob began to cry, not the frustrated tantrum of a toddler, but the deep, grief-stricken sobs of someone saying goodbye to everything they've ever loved. Sarah rushed to him, holding him as he cried. It's okay, baby. It's okay. It's not my home anymore, Jacob sobbed. I'm Jacob now. I have to let Will go. But I don't want to forget. I don't want him to be forgotten. Tom knelt beside them, his voice thick with emotion. We won't forget, buddy. We'll make sure people know about William Harlow. We'll make sure his story is told. Harold approached slowly, removing his worn baseball cap. Jacob, or Will, or whoever you are. Billy Harlow was a good man, one of the best I ever knew. And if you really are carrying his memories somehow, then that's a gift. Don't think of it as a burden. Jacob wiped his eyes. He looked out at the farmland, at the fields where corn had once grown, at the trees standing guard on the western edge. I'm ready to go now, he said quietly. I think Will's ready too. He got to come home one last time. He got to say goodbye. They loaded back into the car as dusk settled over the land. Jacob pressed his face against the window, watching the farm disappear behind them. Goodbye, Will, he whispered. Thank you for sharing your life with me. Tom and Sarah contacted researchers at the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies 3 days after their visit to the Harlow farm. Dr. Jim Tucker's team was immediately interested. Cases involving children under 3 years old were particularly rare and valuable for research. Over the following 6 months, researchers documented everything. They interviewed Harold, Betty, Margaret, and 12 other residents of Fullerton who had known William Harlow. They verified Jacob's statements against property records, obituaries, and county archives. Of the 68 specific factual claims Jacob had made about William Harlow's life, 59 were verified as accurate. 7 were unverifiable due to lack of records. Only 2 were potentially incorrect. Minor details that might have been misremembered or misunderstood through a toddler's limited vocabulary. An 87% accuracy rate for verifiable claims, extraordinary for a 2-year-old who had never been to Fullerton, had never met anyone who knew William Harlow, and had no possible access to information about a man who died before his parents were even born. The toy horse from the buried box now sits on Jacob's bookshelf, next to his stuffed horse. The pocket watch was cleaned and restored. It still worked. Tom and Sarah keep it safe, knowing that someday Jacob might want to pass it on to his own children. Harold Jensen passed away in 2024, 8 months after meeting Jacob. But before he died, he told his daughter, I don't know how it happened, but I got to see my old friend Billy one more time. That little boy carried him back to us, and that's a miracle I'll take to my grave. The Harlow farm still stands abandoned, slowly returning to the earth. But Tom and Sarah visit it once a year with Jacob, maintaining the small area around Rusty's grave and placing flowers by the blue door. And Jacob? His memories of being Will are fading now, the way researchers predicted they would. At age 3, he rarely mentions the farm anymore. The detailed knowledge of farming, the grief over Martha's death, the love for the land, all of it is slipping away like morning fog. But sometimes, when they drive past cornfields in summer, Jacob will stare out the window with a distant look in his eyes. "I think I used to know how to do that," he'll say quietly. "Plant the corn, take care of it. But I can't remember anymore." And Sarah will reach back and squeeze his small hand, grateful that for a brief moment in time, her son carried forward the life of a good man who deserved to be remembered. This case reminds us that memory and identity might be far more complex than we've ever imagined. Jacob's experience suggests that consciousness doesn't always end when a life does, that sometimes the essence of who we are, the memories we cherish, the love we carry, might find a way to continue. Not as ghosts or spirits, but as whispers passed forward, carried in the minds of children who speak of lives they never lived. What do you think happened here? Could a 2-year-old really carry the memories of a man who died decades before? Or is there a rational explanation we're missing? If cases like Jacob's fascinate you, hit that subscribe button. We investigate documented reincarnation cases with scientific rigor every single day. Drop your theory in the comments below. I read every single one, and I genuinely want to hear what you think explains how Jacob knew exactly where that box was buried. How could he draw a map to a place he'd never been? For more scientifically investigated cases that challenge everything we think we know about consciousness and memory, check out the full playlist in the description.